Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Brennan with the Notre Dame Alumni Association. Thanks so much for joining us for another edition of Behind the Headlines. Last week, Pope Francis released his much anticipated encyclical on the environment. Today we'll be exploring that encyclical and its implications, and we're thrilled to have with us Celia Deane-Drummond, the inaugural director of the Center for Theology, Science, and Human Flourishing here at Notre Dame. Professor Deane-Drummond has been working at the intersection of theology and ecology for the past 25 years, and she's really the perfect expert to join us today to discuss the encyclical. So, Professor Deane-Drummond, thanks so much for being here with us.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a real privilege to be here and a privilege to have witnessed the encyclical coming out on the 18th of June. That happens to be my birthday as well.
Well, happy birthday. Real quick, I'm just going to tell our audience here, the way the program's going to work today, Professor Deane-Drummond is going to kind of walk you through her presentation, and on the second half of today's program, she's going to be answering your questions. You can submit your questions using the form you see just below the streaming player on the page there. You can submit as many questions as you like. You can start submitting them now. Do so throughout the presentation today, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can as time allows. So with that, Professor Deane-Drummond, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Fragile Earth, Catholic Social Teaching and Ecology. And so what I'm intending to do today is to walk you through some of the background to this encyclical, because it hasn't just come out of the blue. It's come out as a result of a build-up between Catholic social teaching and ecology that's been going on since the 1970s. So just to give you a few idea of the themes of the webinar, and maybe we can have the slides that show that. First of all, the historical emergence of Catholic social teaching and ecology. Then building a theological mandate for poverty and ecology, which I call the, the 5 pillars. Then peace, solidarity and the virtues, and then a fuller discussion of the encyclical itself, which I'm calling a theological tapestry, because I think it's very important to underwrite the theological and the ethical aspects of this encyclical, as well as think through some of the political and the social consequences of it. So first of all then, the historical emergence of Catholic social thought and ecology. Is Benedict XVI the first Green Pope? That was aired at some time when he was in the papacy. He is, in as much as he put solar panels on the Vatican, and the Vatican itself became the first carbon neutral state. On the other hand, what I'm showing today too is that there are papal encyclicals prior to that which actually started talking about the environment in relation to Catholic social teaching. Rachel Carson in 1962 and Lynn White, as well as Sean Mcdonough, were key figures that started, as it were, the wider social movement of thinking through the implications of the environmental questions and issues. Rachel Carson wrote a book called Silent Spring, and in that book she detailed the pollution that was going on mostly in the United States, and the impact of that, the devastating impact of that. Lynn White is also significant because Lynn White accused Christianity of being the cause of the ecological crisis in 1967. Sean Mcdonough, who is a Colombian priest and a Catholic priest, took a more practical take on this by actually going out to the Philippines and actually working as a Colombian missionary and seeing firsthand some of the effects of environmental devastation and climate impact on those people living in the poorest regions of the world. Pope Paul VI wrote his letters, you'll see, around that kind of time, and in that particular letter he started talking about the dangers of environmental irresponsibility and the need to act. But what I'm going to focus on today is the theological mandates for that action. And it was really only with Pope John Paul II that we start finding a theological mandate being built up, rather than just the stray statements about the need for environmental responsibility and so on. And in these 5 pillars, as I would call them, Christ is portrayed in a cosmological perspective. So Christ is the saviour not just of human beings, but also there's a wider implications for the natural world as well. The idea of structural sin, that sin isn't simply a matter of individual human activities on an individual basis, but also wider structures of what that sin might mean. Image bearing and integral human development, and then fourthly, perspectives on the earth itself and the idea of ecological conversion. So let's start then with Christ and creation. Pope John Paul II, in the first encyclical that he wrote in 1979, were full of references to environmental concern. So you might think that the papal encyclical that's just been released is something brand new. Well, actually it's not. It goes right back to this one and the earlier ones as well that I've mentioned, but this time it's giving a theological basis for why we should worry about these considerations. There's also a strong theological link between Christ and creation, and I'm giving you a citation here. In Jesus Christ, the visible world which God created for man, the world that, when sin entered, was subject to futility, recovers again its original link with a divine source of wisdom and love. So in other words, creation and Christ are intimately connected. The two are not separated, but the care for the earth, as it were, goes right back to this theological idea of Christ being the author of creation with God in a sort of Trinitarian cosmic Christology. Christology meaning an understanding of who Christ is. The second issue is structural sin, and here we find in the 1987 Encyclical the idea of super development coming up that becomes more important again with Pope Benedict XVI. And again in St. Mcdonough, the roots of the ecological destruction is an anthropological error. The third element, and I have to say that all these elements are in the most recent encyclical as well, so I'm just proving to you that this structure, as it were, has been thought of already. The image of Gardner comes through very strongly in that, and also the idea of integral human development. And so we find quotations as this one: too little effort is made to safeguard the moral conditions for an authentic human ecology. You notice the language of human ecology, because that becomes important in Pope Francis's encyclical, where he talks about something else, but something connected to that idea of human ecology. And the idea here being that our ecological relationships are important for humans right back to the first human beings, but also our understanding of who we are as humans is connected with how we understand ourselves in relationship to other creatures and also in a relationship to God. So that's roughly what human ecology means, although I'm happy to take questions on that later. So this idea then of flourishing in relation to authentic human ecology is very important. Another theme we get in this in the lead up towards this encyclical are different kinds of perspectives on the earth. The idea of the natural world or the earth itself having some sort of agency, and it's something that perhaps has seemed surprising in the most recent encyclical, but actually it's there already in some of the earlier encyclicals. So and obviously it hasn't been taken much notice of until now, but where humans refuse to submit to God's rule, quote, nature rebels against him and no longer recognizes him as its master, for he has tarnished the divine image in himself. Now this idea of tarnishing the divine image because of the way we treat the natural world is again something that's spelt out in the most recent encyclical, perhaps even more explicitly, but it's certainly there for all to see in the early encyclicals, especially of Pope John Paul II. Excuse me. Another key idea is the idea of ecological conversion, which also Pope John Paul II took from a collaboration with Bartholomew I, the ecumenical patriarchate. And in this, in this particular letter that they wrote together, or statement, he said this: "A solution at the economic and technological level can be found only if we undergo, in the most radical way, an inner change of heart, which can lead to a change in lifestyle and of unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. A genuine conversion in Christ will enable us to change the way we think and act." So this deep conversion to our patterns of lifestyle and so on, is something that's become a lot more prominent in the encyclical we're reading from last week. But it's still very much there in the prior encyclicals. The next section I want to for us to think about is the idea of peace, solidarity, and the virtues. The ecological virtues in particular are these ones: contemplation, wonder, mercy, compassion, humility, respect, wisdom, faith, and hope, but also ones of temperance and chastity and the ascetic tradition. So this has come through in the prior encyclicals, but it's also understood or presupposed and developed upon in the encyclical we have from last week. Mercy then, and then I think this is a really interesting citation that comes from an encyclical that Pope John Paul II wrote in 1980. The word and the concept of mercy seems to cause uneasiness in man who, thanks to the enormous development of science and technology, never before known in history, has become the master of the earth and has subdued and dominated it. This dominion over the earth, sometimes understood in a one-sided and superficial way, seems to leave no room for mercy. And so that idea that the natural world is also a topic of our appreciation of what mercy means is particularly important, I think. And then again, peace and solidarity, the World Day messages of peace. All of those are packed full of references to environmental concern. In 2010, for example, the title of Benedict's World Day Message of Peace was this: "If you want to cultivate peace, protect creation." It couldn't be much more explicit than that. Justice making. Justice as a virtue beyond the legal frameworks is important, but also attention to environmental justice as well as ecological justice. By environmental justice, I mean justice to those who are feeling the impacts of climate change, people who are feeling those impacts. Ecological justice is more directly on the devastation of the earth itself and its different creatures and so on. But also just distribution of basic resources in the face of climate impacts. Collective and individual conscience also comes to the surface in places, so it's related to the virtue of practical wisdom, which is operative at both individual and collective levels, but the need too for a collective ecological responsibility, and that is again a very strong theme. What about the elements in here? So, the aesthetic elements. Certainly, aesthetic elements enrich the human life, but human flourishing is also inclusive of the flourishing of other creatures. And so now we're ready, as it were, to actually tackle the encyclical itself. Laudate si, praise be to you, which comes from the praise poem of St. Francis of Assisi. It's a direct quotation from that. And I call these 7 flavours, although it'd probably be better to say 7 threads, given that I'm talking about a theological tapestry. Really what he's saying here, I believe, is the backbone of why particular changes are needed, and against the critical remarks that have been made against towards his own sense of judgment in this, is that he's actually responding to the signs of our times, and so he's responding in a way which makes him, as it were, the appropriate bishop of the church, because what he says, as I was going to suggest to you, is a very rich theological tapestry. And so the first element of that is one of praise, and I believe it's the central inspiration here. how can we praise God, and how can other creatures praise God? How can we share in that praise? Of course, those creatures that praise God are doing so without knowing that they are praising God, but at the same time it's a celebration of life, and of all of life, not just human life, but human life and other life forms. And in this sense, he has common ground with the ecologists and biologists of the world, who will be welcome this kind of message. But then we also need to think about what I call the silenced, the violence that humanity has portrayed on the earth, the violence that's appropriately articulated in Romans 8:22, where the Bible talks about the whole earth groans, the whole of the creation groans in travail. In addition to that, the violence towards the earth is also understood as a sin. And this is something that he picks up from some of the earlier encyclicals and develops it in a new way. There again, the earth itself is a gift. The gift, and we've abused that gift, and the gift of life. This is a fragile earth, shown in this portrayal of the earth from outer space. So how do we get back from the violence of the silenced to the gift of the earth that we have for us? How do we begin to move from one to the other? And the thesis that's in this encyclical, and also in other places in the earlier encyclical, is that we get back to this by ecological conversion. That is, we have to be converted in our hearts and minds to think more carefully about what we're doing and how and why we are doing it. So the idea of ecological conversion is very important, and it tops and tails his encyclical. It's at the beginning of the encyclical, and it comes through at the end. At the beginning it talks about the ecological conversion in terms of environmental issues and environmental awareness. By the end we begin to have the idea of Pope John Paul II, which is the idea of being converted to Christ as part of what ecological conversion means. And it may surprise some of you to know that actually Francis of Assisi did exactly the same. He was known to be the patron saint of ecologists, but he also spoke about conversion to Christ as being foremost. And so it goes back to this idea of a cosmic Christology as well. This idea that we align ourselves with Christ, and then we automatically will align ourselves with the value and the worth of other creatures. And so this requires a conversion, a change of heart and mind, as Bartholomew I and Pope John Paul II said. And so we need to think, how do we begin to move in that direction? How can we get motivated in order to have this conversion for us? And there are various threads that begin to spell out how that might be possible. And the first thread in the tapestry is that of love. And so the love motif is very significant. And expresses that love is at the heart of what it means to be human, is in this encyclical, and love towards one another, but also love of God and love of creatures. So God's love for creation, and humans in particular, provides a check on the idea of human freedom, which is freedom with no limits. And it's expressed again in this idea of integral ecology, where love refuses to exploit creatures, and it works for the protection of them. It resists what Pope Francis calls an irrational confidence in progress. It has particular practical consequences too, with this idea of integral ecology. Notice it's changed now from the idea of human ecology. He's called it integral ecology, and that's because it includes human ecology, it includes creaturely ecology, and economic ecology as well, a new kind of economics. Again, Pope Benedict XVI talked about a new kind of economics as well, but he used the language of gratuitousness or gift, whereas what Pope Francis is doing here is bringing in the idea of an integral ecology, including a new ecological economics. And the next thread is one of hope, and I think it's very important that this hope is very much part of what it means to be Imago Dei, or in the image of God. And it's the idea that another world is possible, that we've lost something of this hope in the particular cultures in which we find ourselves. But the hope is not just for ourselves, but for the common good, so the good for all and the good for each. And then as we go to the Encyclical itself, because all creatures are connected, each must be cherished with love and respect, for all of us as living creatures are dependent on one another. So hope extends and includes both the poorest nations of the world and hope for creaturely flourishing. And so we have then a differential responsibility. Population growth is barely mentioned in this encyclical, or where it is, it's not counted as being highly significant for what's going on in terms of the devastation. There's a stress there and a huge challenge on overconsumption by a few, which is going to benefit the few, but also be detrimental for the majority, especially those who are marginalized and not recognized. In the lead up towards the climate summit in Paris, or COP21, there is a push here too for a much greater sense of responsibility by those who are in positions of power. And so there is a political hope built in, as well as a hope for individuals or communities within their communities. Glory is another important theme here. It's perhaps a little bit more underplayed, but certainly it's premised on a deep sense of interdependence, where living things express the glory of God. And so bubbling beneath the surface of hope for creation and hope for glory is the idea that faith allows us to interpret the meaning of the mysterious beauty of what is unfolding. And behind that faith is the presence of the Holy Spirit in the midst of these difficulties, and a confidence, to quote, that something new can emerge. A vocation then, again quoting him, to lead all creatures back to their Creator. And so we find then a pervasive sense of joy, which picks up again on some of his earlier work, but pervades all creation and creatures in a natural revelation. So the joy of the gospel is also the joy of other creatures being celebrated, and a joy of being content to live with little rather than in excess. So Christian spirituality proposes a growth marked by moderation and a capacity to be happy with little. And so in this sense it's a liberating faith. It's a liberation theology for the West and for those who are trapped perhaps by their devices or technologies. And the Pope Francis is also critical of the way we've become too attuned just to our devices and no longer able to connect or relate to one another or the natural world in the way that's appropriate for human beings. And so we come again to this idea of humility, and humility in the face of limitations, and means a proper assessment of our gifts rather than debasement. And once we lose our humility and become enthralled with the possibility of limitless mastery over everything, we inevitably end up harming society and the environment. So what joins up praise, gifts, love, hope, glory, joy and humility? What joins all those together is the idea of peace. And again, going back to this idea of integral ecology again. Now echoing the Sabbath rest, which is a biblical theme from the book of Genesis, the story of creation. It's not a Sabbath rest of collapsing in a heap of exhaustion, but it's rather a celebratory Sabbath. And so when we come to see how policies might be shaped, then there's a holistic understanding of the human person, but one entangled with other creatures and others. There's a universal message of the common good, but while those who are outside the household of faith might speak more about beauty, he speaks more of glory, while those who are not necessarily Christians will speak of violence, he speaks of sin. And so the lines of approach are drawn out with only a few specific instructions, but there are some, such as this one, that technology based on the use of highly polluting fuels, especially coal, but also oil and to a lesser degree gas, needs to be progressively replaced without delay. So how then can we move again from some of these policies to other practices? First of all, the harmful forms of inequity prevail, and we need to take account of that. But he's not romantic either about those in the developing world, where even in these countries there are scandalous levels of consumption in some privileged sectors of their population. But also the need for enforceable national and international agreements. So the sin of injustice prevails, but I'd have to say that the media portrayal of this encyclical as Marxist completely misses the point, because it's the transcendent dimension of this encyclical that's really stressed rather than the horizontal one. And it's also primarily concerned with oppression and the victims of that oppression. What religious leaders have not also had political leaders have also not had, to some extent, a religious commitment. Think of Martin Luther King, for example. What's really stressed then is the underside of those in history and giving them meaning and a status. But behind this is the idea of covenant, that environmental education should facilitate making the leap towards the transcendent, which gives ecological ethics its deepest meaning. So just reinforcing this point again, that the transcendent is so important to this encyclical. In addition to that, the solidarity with and compassion for the vulnerable. So what he's calling for here is not so much a political revolution, but a cultural revolution, which challenges all aspects of politics and not simply one political party. So away from an over-dependence on technologies to something far more rigorous or specialist in terms of how we think about the natural world, how we think about ourselves as human beings, as human creatures, made in the image and likeness of God. So how do we begin then to do that, and how do we practice that in the church? And for that I'd like us to think about the idea of sacrament. So we get this, it echoes to some extent the thought of Teilhard de Chardin, when this is at the closing stages of the encyclical, and I've nearly finished because I know. And in the Eucharist, fullness is already achieved. It is the living centre of the universe, the overflowing core of love and inexhaustible life. So it's a cosmic understanding of the sacraments. And in addition to that, we have this idea of divinization. So creation is projected towards divinization, towards the holy wedding feast, towards the unification with the Creator himself. And then finally, for those who've noticed the idea of the earth as mother in places in this encyclical, he comes down in the end with this idea of Mary as mother of the earth, just as mother of us all. And so just as her pierced heart mourned the death of Jesus, so now she grieves for the suffering of the crucified poor and for the creatures of this world, and laid waste by human power. So Mary is given a special place then in caring for the broken world around us. But it's appropriate for Francis to end on a word of prayer, a prayer of praise for all creatures, a praise for humanity, a praise for the God that he worships himself and wants to encourage other people to worship. And so, as I said, the seven elements of the tapestry, the theological tapestry that we see, comes to the surface in different places in the encyclical. But there are elements here which are truly traditional, but also, to some extent, radical in its message. And I think that message needs to be taken to heart by the church, by those in the ordinary pews, by those who may be not in the household of faith, those who share, as Pope Francis says, our common home. And that, I think, is enough. So I'm very look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Deane-Drummond. For those of you watching live, remember, now we're going to be taking your questions. So you can submit your questions using that question and answer form right underneath the streaming video player, and we're going to get to as many of them as we can. Professor Deane-Drummond, kind of to start off on, related to the note you just ended on there, In the opening, paragraphs of the encyclical, Pope Francis makes a clear point that his audience for this papal encyclical is not just the bishops, not just the Catholic Church, but the whole world, really. Is that unusual for a papal encyclical? And why do you think it was important to Pope Francis to explicitly make that point?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and I think that I think that we need to be aware that to some extent that all encyclicals have a sort of double message. Although I would agree with you that this particular encyclical is far more explicit about that element, and I think one of the reasons it's so important is because this is our common home. As he says, that it's not enough just for Christians to act in this way. We also need to join forces with others who are from other religious traditions, or maybe those who have no religious tradition. We're in this common boat together, and therefore we need to be aware of how we can work together, and that's what he's trying to do. And I think, as a world leader in the church, he does have that charism. He has the charism to bring people together. He has the charism to influence people who are maybe not believers themselves, to strike chords with those who are perhaps from different religious traditions. And he does that in the way he lives as well, the way he pays attention to those who are not necessarily just in the church. But I think it is a message for the church as well. And so we shouldn't think that this is an evangelical document to convince people of the worth of Christianity or some of its ideas of Catholic social thought, like the common good. But it's a rallying cry, really, because the issues that we face are so severe and so problematic that we can't really afford just to act in a unilateral way. We have to join together.
At the beginning of your presentation, you kind of walked us through the foundation for this, that this isn't the first time the Church or the Vatican is talking about this issue, and particularly with Pope Francis's two immediate predecessors. This was something that's been talked about before. Pope Francis did sort of the same thing in his encyclical, right? He referenced the teachings of the prior popes. Why do you think it was important to him to establish to his audience that this is not a new topic that the Vatican and the Church are taking up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it's important because I think he could be accused of going too far in terms of his alignment with or respect for some of the scientific elements in this, like climate change, or maybe concern for creatures, or concern for pollution, or concern for policies and so on. But this has been at the heart of Catholic social thought for centuries. So it's just not good enough to say that, keep Francis out of politics, because that means you keep out virtually every single encyclical that's ever been written. So I think we need to be aware of the basis of why he's doing this, but also that it does build on the tradition, the magisterial teaching of the Church. It does build it in a slightly different way from some of the other ones, but it does still use those resources very richly and to good effect.
Thanks. I think we're ready to take our first question from the audience here. I believe it's coming in from Michael. And Michael asks, the theological concepts being discussed today seem perfectly logical, but implementing them remains today very poorly defined. Would you agree?
Yes, I think that what I did today was stress the theological elements, but the way he spells out how to implement them is in the encyclical itself. But you're right that they're not as clear cut. There are a few examples of explicit instructions, like come off coal. The way we might work, say, at COP21 to build a more robust international structure. Most papal statements are never completely explicit in how they hope that their work will be taken up. So it's certainly not unusual not to be completely explicit. But there are some there that give you a clue as to the kind of framework that he might suggest. He also says that we should become less attached to our cell phones and technologies and that kind of thing. So I think it's a cultural revolution he's after, and the way that's then picked up in different cultures will be situated for the benefit of those cultures. So each culture will differ, or each subculture will differ in terms of how that it could possibly use this message. And so he's been restrained, I think, about spelling too much out. And I think that although that might be irritating for some people, I think it also makes this message much more flexible. And so it's really up to the church now, the lay people in the church and the bishops of the church and other priests and people together to work out how will this apply in my own congregation, in my own life, in my own lifestyle. Where the idea of super development, of overdevelopment is also in here as well. So there are fairly obvious steps that we can begin to think about to take in order to implement some of this message, I think.
Great. We've got another question coming in here from one of our live viewers, and we can pull it up here. It comes from Father Wirtz. He asks, could you recommend a book to help us understand better the theological threads discussed today?
Okay. Part of the problem is the book itself has yet to be written, in a sense, in that this is Pope Francis's Encyclical, so it draws from that. There are a number of books on eco-theology that have been published. I've published one called Eco-Theology. There are others that deal with more explicitly with Catholic social thought, and if you're interested in actually following up some of the material I've spoken about myself today, there is an article with the Australian Broadcasting Association that can be available for anyone in this webinar to read. But I think the idea of joy, faith, hope, and so on, those have been part of the theological discussion on these areas for some time. But I've put it in such a way as to try and encourage our theological interpretation of what's going on, rather than just go into the nitty-gritty of some of the practical examples. But there's a massive literature on eco-theology. There's a book edited by Ernst Conradi and myself and others called Christian Faith and the Earth, which does a great job of showing the spread ecumenically of different positions on this. Also, Bartholomew I has written extensively, and there are links on the Ecumenical Patriarchate website to show theological resources that connect with these themes. So I would say that, and of course there's all the Franciscan literature as well on Franciscan thought and ecology, including some work by Franciscan scholars that deal with some of these issues from an ecological perspective. Is that enough?
Yeah, I think that's a good reading list for us. We've got another question coming in here from the audience, from Ken. He asks, how can we urge parishes to set up Francis funds, which will pool parish funds to pay for solar panel installations atop churches and on parking lots, as well as offer parishioners a chance to invest in solar?
Right, now that's an interesting question, interesting idea. I mean, I think if enough people were prepared to give even a small amount to this proposal, then it could fly. How can you encourage them? Maybe just by showing the message itself, which is deep at the heart of our faith. Dennis Edwards, I should have mentioned, has written a book called Ecology at the Heart of Faith, and he's a Catholic priest from Australia, and I would say that Australia are one of the leading, the collection of scholars in Australia are some of the leading scholars. So that kind of book could possibly be used as a study guide, as well as the Encyclical itself, to try and encourage parishioners to commit themselves. I would like to see this coming out more in the pulpit as well. It tends to be avoided. So, when there is a discussion of the Genesis text, for example, on Imago Dei and what that means, maybe this could come up, and so on and so forth. So as a Catholic priest yourself, you have a huge opportunity to influence some of these developments, and just encourage people, because if people don't know about it, they're not going to respond. That's my hope, at least.
In the past, when the issue of climate change is discussed in our society, it seems like most people kind of consider it a scientific issue or a political one. But with this encyclical, do you think we're moving towards a place where religion and spirituality are also going to be kind of mentioned in the same vein, and that people are going to start thinking of the environment and climate change as a religious or moral or spiritual issue?
Yes, I mean, for me, it's always climate change and theology have always been closely interconnected, because we care about the creation, we care about the earth, because the earth is God's gift to us. So, and one Orthodox theologian once said, to be Christian is to be ecologist. So this isn't something radically new, and I want to stress that again and again. This isn't something way off or pantheist or anything like that. Pantheist meaning the worship of God in the natural world. This is about God's immanent presence in the world, a very traditional view, and why you know the damage to that world is also something that Christians need to take seriously. And I also think that there's a wider secular move, interestingly enough, amongst anthropologists and evolutionary biologists now, to consider that maybe the secular reductionism of the sciences isn't enough, that actually there's something else going on here that's transcendent that we need to take account of. And therefore they would welcome this kind of message of Pope Francis, because it's touching on that transcendent instinct that many people have, and that we've, you know, you could say that even if you believe in evolution and nothing more, that we have evolved to be religious. We've evolved to have, if you like, a place in our being for who God is. And so this is a way of actually understanding what that is all about, understanding that we share our common home with other creatures. My own research at the moment is partly interested in the human-other animal interrelationships and how they've formed so much our earliest histories, and our earliest understanding of who we are, even as moral beings, has been shaped by these interspecies interactions. So this isn't something that's newfangled theology or newfangled science. It's solid science, solid evolutionary biology, combining with an understanding of our own faith and how it meets or meshes with the signs of our times. And I think that this is really exciting, and it's sort of probably for me one of the most interesting and important encyclicals that's ever been written. And I think it is Pope Francis is an icon for the Anthropocene. We are living in the Anthropocene, which means that our actions are such that everything that we do is becoming inculcated into the geological record. It's changing that record in a way that's irreversible. And so this idea of the Anthropocene is something that we need to also take seriously. And so if we're going to shift or move in a way that makes a difference for the good, rather than in a sense self-destruct, then we need to have new ways of thinking and acting. And human beings are very, very good at doing that. We're very good at resilience, we're very good at adaptation in some respects. We need to build those communities that are less good at that. But I'm saying that this kind of spirit, as it were, is necessary, and that's why I've stressed the theological threads in this, because I think without that we're not going to have the motivation to act differently.
Reminder to those of you watching live, you can submit your questions using the question and answer form that's just underneath the live streaming player. And I think we have another question here coming in from the audience. This one's from Michael. Why is there no attention given to the counterviews which disagree with the premise that humans are the cause of climate change? This is not, as far as I have read, a totally agreed upon conclusion.
Okay, it depends on the scientific accounts or reports that you read. Of course, the media portrays this as a debate still, because they like debates. And unfortunately, the number of scientists who believe that humans are not the cause of climate change are probably about 1% or 0.5 of 1%. So really there's a consensus. So I would say that it's similar to believing that there's no such thing as evolution. Or natural selection, evolution by natural selection. Of course, there are some people who believe there's no such thing as natural selection. You get the creationists believing that, say, who are mostly from Protestant denominations. But in generally speaking, there is an overall scientific consensus, and I think Pope Francis has followed that. He's a chemist by training, he's a scientist. Why is there no attention to counter views? Well, really, because they're no longer really on the table. They are on the table for certain political parties, unfortunately, because they're trying to create or undercut the policy and the political implications of this message. And so it's a hard thing to ask. It's a hard thing to ask people to change lifestyles. People would prefer to escape into these other worldviews which maybe conform and allow that people to to stick with their own lifestyles rather than having to change. And so this is the hard message for all of us, and I speak of myself included. We're all wrapped up in this problem together, and we need to see it and work it out together rather than seeing it as simply for the few. And so as a scientist by training myself, I've got a doctorate in plant physiology, I have a background in the natural sciences. I really don't think there's any reason to believe that the so-called alternative science is worth speaking of hardly any more than it's worth speaking of the idea that God directly creates creatures from scratch without any evolutionary processes. The two are fairly similar, and they're both what I would call fundamentalist positions.
All right, we've got another question coming in from Christine, and she asks, are the sources with the scientific data presumably supporting the Encyclical's position available?
Okay, yes, there are, if you look at NASA, the NASA website, there are dozens of references in here, and also the International Panel on Climate Change. There are different reports, including the most recent reports. Those reports are normally conservative estimates. And so the chances are that climate change is far worse, especially the anthropogenic climate change, than is portrayed by most of these reports. But it's with the best scientific consensus written by literally hundreds and hundreds of scientists coming together and confirming and agreeing on what is the most likely scenario. Now the difficulty is that science will never talk in absolutes. And when the public media hear this, they assume there's some sort of debate. But that's the nature of science. Science never makes pronounced statements as if to say when 100% certain, because there's always going to be an element of uncertainty because of the scientific methods that are being used. Climate change itself is also in that realm of uncertainty, but at the same time both the so-called climate change deniers and climate change supporters notice the language of almost religious belief in these debates, which is itself interesting. They do agree on one thing, that things are changing for the worse. The question then is how much have human beings contributed? And again, the evidence is building up for that, and the estimates according to carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, climate increases in temperature and so on have been detailed over, certainly both in the short term but also in the long term, by using core ice cores which show the temperature differences and how they're correlated with carbon dioxide changes. I mean, the list is virtually endless in terms of the evidence, whereas the evidence for the alternative view is minimal and not particularly well thought through.
Just a reminder for those of you joining us live, we've got about 10 minutes left, so if you have more questions for Professor Deane-Drummond here, please submit them now, and we'll try to get to them before our program ends today. With that, let's move on to our next question from the audience. This is from Christina. How do we as Catholics strive for change in the global economic structures? Does this change or reorient the Notre Dame community?
Okay, this is a brilliant question because I think that the problem here is what about Notre Dame itself? And I think that you're absolutely right that the Notre Dame has to get its house in order, there are a few of us who have been trying to do that in dialogue with some of those who are working here at the university. But at the same time, the Institute for Global Health, for example, I teach on that course, on the bioethics course. We regularly or always include a central element of sustainability and the importance of other impacts like climate change in that course. So I mean, when you're dealing with issues such as climate change, it affects the population of diseases as well as individual species, and that didn't come through in the Encyclical, of course. But the impacts of this kind of thinking are huge. How do we begin to influence the global community? That is another enormous problem. I think the global community itself, in its build up to the global summit in Paris in later this year, COP21 as it's called, whether Notre Dame can actually influence the outcome of that debate, I suspect it can. It's going to have some representation there, as I understand it. So there are big questions and issues yet to be addressed. And what I would say is that those who are in positions of power where they can make a difference need to step up to the plate and act in a way that will implement some of this in the global commons.
Great. Let's take our next question from our live audience here. This comes from Claire. If you were advising the U.S. bishops or local pastors on how to integrate the rich teachings of this encyclical into the parish life, what would you recommend?
Well, this is a good question. That's why I've done the theological threads, because I think that most bishops and priests will be interested in theological education, and so therefore, if we start with that and show how the encyclical responds to that need, that lack, as it were, of some of those elements, some of those virtues are underdeveloped, then maybe that will be a one way of building in reading of this encyclical. I think that at a parish level, each of the segments, there are the different chapters in the encyclical that could be used. Each of these chapters could form a segment of some sort of study course. In addition, there could be other groups that could think more clearly about some of the implications in terms of social justice questions in the local community or in the wider global community. So there's a wide, and then there could be the practical implications of how to clean up their act, as it were. What about the buildings that are being built? Are they taking into account the carbon footprint of that building or not? How far do our own buildings, lifestyles, habits, how far do they reflect it? So just simple changes, small changes can make a big difference. And I think that there are organisations like A Rocha, for example, that deal with practical examples of how Christians can get involved in protecting other creatures, including the wider issues of biodiversity. So if people want to support those, perhaps that could also be a means of fundraising for some of those groups, rather than just restricting it to some of the more favourite organisations.
Our next question is coming in from McKenna. McKenna asks, what can younger students do to act on this knowledge of these topics and the now more apparent theological relationship between the earth's health and faith?
Okay, thank you for that question. You have your whole life ahead of you, as it were, to make choices about your careers, make choices about where to put your energies in the future, how to commit yourself in terms of making a difference. And I think that individuals can act in ways that make decisions that will make a difference. There will be opportunities to, when you make a decision about your career path or your own work position, as to whether they will be environmentally responsible or not in doing that kind of work or not. And so I think that having the common good in mind is very important, and having the good of the earth, our common earth and home, is also extremely important. So I would say that contemplation and action, both go together like hand in a glove. That we need time to be apart from our technologies and devices, but also time to be with the natural world, with one another. So, and building up our own sense of our inner self needs to be made strong, as one of the Paul's letters suggests, in order to be able to act aright. So we need times away for prayer and reflection, contemplation, as well as then putting this into practice. So that's my recommendation, that we don't squeeze out the need for prayer, reflection, spending time, appreciating the world around us, and it's obvious to me anyway in the way Pope Francis acts, and also his whole manner of being, that he's been transformed through prayer. And so therefore, he gives us a good example to follow. We imitate Christ, but we also have other saints and scholars to follow or to inspire us, and I think that Pope Francis will give us that kind of inspiration.
Great. We've got a question coming in from Andrew, who asks, what would your recommendation be for parishioners to get their parish priests to start talking about this at the pulpit?
Yeah, that's another great question. Maybe just encourage them to read the encyclical itself, or summaries of it, because it is a very large document. but anyone who reads it can't help be captivated by its message, and it has to sink in. There are also, for those who don't have time to read the Encyclical, there are shortened summaries written by Catholic Earth Care in the US and other places. I can provide some web links to some of those if that's helpful. But in a way that priests do have the responsibility to read some of the encyclicals of the Pope. But if those who are too hard pressed by the demands of their parish life to do that, then maybe some of these other summaries or newspaper articles that have been written by theologians rather than media reporters will have a good effect.
Great. We'll take one more question from the audience here. This comes in from CK. What does the Encyclical offer for populations living in resource-deficient areas of the world? Also, does its warnings against overconsumption offer a critique of global markets and support for more simple local economies?
Okay. Yes, I think that, the whole document is written, as it were, from the perspective of those who are living in the more deprived areas of the world, especially those who are being oppressed by the particular economies. And there is a strident critique of the global economy as such. And that's why in some ways it's apolitical, because it's criticizing all political parties for the way the market economy is run. So at the same time, there is a realism about the need to invest, and a realism about the need to have economic structures in place that are more ecologically sustainable. And I would say that those who are living or working in some of these most deprived areas of the world can take hope from this message. So it's a criticism of injustice wherever it exists, rather than pointing the finger only at the Western world. So because even within some of the resource-deprived areas of the world, you get these disparities of rich and very, very, very rich and very deprived, and so he wants to point that out as well. One of the difficulties, of course, is to how to regenerate a global economy along lines which are not the current system, and that is going to be hard work for economists and others to come up with some suitable alternatives. But I think it is possible. I have talked to a number of economic professors over the years, and it is possible to have economics done in a way that's not necessarily controlled by the market. That there are if you like, economies without inevitable growth. So it's this development of progress as such which is challenged. This obsession with progress at all costs, and progress according to certain models of GNP rather than according to the way we grow as human beings. So I think that is going to be very, very interesting to see how that falls out. But we can't expect the Pope Francis to fill out all those details in one encyclical. But there are clues, at least, in here, embedded in the document.
Well, Professor Deane-Drummond, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're all out of time. I know we all learned a lot about this groundbreaking encyclical and this important topic, so thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everybody for your excellent questions.
Yeah, thanks to all of those of you who watched live and submitted those great questions, and thanks to anyone watching the recording later. Remember to stay connected with the Notre Dame family throughout the year on issues of faith and spirituality. Visit FaithND and make sure to sign up for our daily gospel reflection. As well, if you would like to watch old online learning programs from the Alumni Association and stay up to date on our upcoming events, please visit us at my.nd.edu/learn. I'm Kevin Brennan with the Notre Dame Alumni Association. Thanks so much for watching.
Okay.